All right, here we are for chapter 3. Again, I hope everyone's doing well, enjoying their week, and hopefully these video lectures aren't um, too awful. A little overview of what we'll be going through. The last two have been fairly long. My apologies. We try to keep them around 30 minutes. So this one I will make a little bit shorter. Just don't tell Mrs. Moppin. Overview of what we'll be reviewing is development from newborn through adulthood very briefly. Again, my caveat for this entire class is that it'll be snippets and a glimpse of these aspects of psychology. It's difficult to go fully in depth, but you guys are just scraping the surface and gaining interest and hopefully enjoying the process of learning about some of these topics. We'll first do infancy and childhood developmental theories, go through some neurodevelopmental disorders like autism. We'll discuss some parenting styles, adolescent development, and then some on adulthood. So to start off, babies. I just had a baby, so this is kind of interesting for me to review. I won't delve too far into the biology of this. There's on page 71 a table with some important definitions, but essentially you have the result of the sexual intercourse where the egg is fertilized by the sperm, and then you have this process of a developing into a fetus. And the details here in this image involve the egg's nucleus and sperm nuclei fusing together, becoming a single entity, organically developing into what would turn into a zygote at conception to 2 weeks, and then next it would be an embryo from 2 weeks to 8 weeks, and then into what they technically call a fetus at 9 weeks to birth. And all of these are just words and terms. These are not like definitive explanations of development, as much as a scientist said, hey, let's call this a zygote, and it'll be a zygote from conception to 2 weeks, and let's call this a fetus, and it'll start at 9 weeks. It's fairly derived, and I wouldn't put too much weight into these definitions. But as a fetus develops, which is then the growing infant baby, what's going to turn into a human, you have all of these aspects of your parents' conjoined DNA. So it's half one parent and half the other, unless there's some genetic abnormality, combining their DNA into that one human. It's a pretty incredible process. A little bit on prenatal development and newborns. So the mother and the fetus are inextricably connected, and everything the mother does to some extent is shared with the fetus. So anything that might harm the fetus, the book has, I think, the term teratogens in there. That's a environmental influence that would bring harm to the fetus. And one that gets a lot of attention is drinking alcohol or any kind of substance or drug consumption when you're pregnant. Obviously, this, if it's connecting to a fetus has not developed the liver and the digestive properties and everything to process alcohol effectively. So what one adult might be able to ingest is going to be very different for the fetus that's going to be ingesting whatever mom puts into her body. The results of heavy drinking during pregnancy can actually be really detrimental, leading to a condition called fetal alcohol syndrome. And this can present in a number of ways, but essentially a lot of developmental defects and a lot of cognitive impact, a lot of impulsivity. The students in my career that I've worked with that have fetal alcohol syndrome, that have been exposed to large amounts of alcohol or have been exposed in utero to drug abuse, they're often really impacted behaviorally and socially and cognitively. So they would have a hard time thinking as quickly or remembering things and processing information at the same level. School is typically harder, and then behaviorally they'll often be very impulsive, reacting with anger or extreme sadness to situations, and then having a hard time making friends or relating to others. There's some physical abnormalities, usually wider set eyes, space between the nose and lips, balance and some other physical traits. There's a chemical imprint of like what the alcohol can leave on the DNA strands of the baby. Smoking also leaves epigenetic scars that weaken infants' ability to handle stress. So all bad things. Some of what we've talked about in the past, we've gone through our nature versus nurture debate a little bit. A large contributor to that research has been twin studies, and that's a lot of what has helped with studying development and temperament and parenting and genetic influence for children. So 2 types of twins. There's a few other types of twins, but the 2 most common are the identical and fraternal, the monozygotic and dizygotic twins. Identical twins would come from 1 egg with 2 sperm that germinated in it, and then the fraternal or dizygotic twins would be 2 separate eggs, so they would not be identical. They would have obviously the same genetic makeup from their parents combined, but they wouldn't have the same physical appearance and exact DNA replication. And so the way, again, we've talked about this a little bit before, they study twins was they would find twins separated at birth and compare them, even though they had been brought up in complete different environments, subject to complete different parenting, different life entirely, they still shared a lot of similarities. Some unfortunate situations where one baby might have been kept by the biological parents and the other adopted were then found later and compared their temperament and their personalities, and the adopted child was still more similar in some ways to the biological parent. Now, again, my disclaimer is when we're being scholars, we should be curious, we should be skeptical and humble. So a lot of these studies are still talked about in psychology because they're foundational to the field, but there are some current studies that have found this might not be as significant as they once thought. A lot of the studies of twins, there's other variables. We talked about confounding or extraneous variables that maybe weren't taken into account or maybe weren't considered as much as they should have been. So twins with the same biological makeup are obviously going to share traits inherent to those biological frameworks, their DNA. It's not to say that they're going to be confined to those things. You can still have a lot of conditioning and environmental interactions that bring about different traits. But all that to be said, there's a lot of interesting research behind this, but I always encourage you guys to be skeptical. Getting into some developmental theories, there's a lot of different theorists that have come up with different models and frameworks. Again, I think it's important to take a historical lens when it comes to development. Initially, Freud had his psychosexual stages of development, and then that kind of turned into Jung's developmental stages. And then you have some of these theories that focus more on behavior from Skinner and Pavlov and Bandura. And then you have the cognitive revolution where we started focusing more on brain development, and then social interactions, the humanist, and then it's emerged and developed over time. So it's interesting to see humans have been around for a while, and we've come up with a lot of different theories and models for how we develop and why we develop. These frameworks are to suggest a general model for understanding development. So from babies through infants, through children, through adolescents, through young adults, through adults, all the way until the end. So Piaget's theory of cognitive development, there's some great examples in the book. I'll briefly overview the stages. Birth stage 2, that's the sensory motor stage. Everything that a baby is experiencing at this stage is going to be through their senses. What they touch, what they taste, what they smell, what they hear, what they feel, how they're interacting in space and time, and what they see. And that's going to shape a lot of their brain activity and their brain development. One thing that is unique to this age is interesting, the object permanence phenomenon. That's where you're playing peekaboo with a baby. If you show your face and they smile and they see you and they recognize there's a person here, And then if you just hold up a blanket, it's obvious that the person's still there, but to this child with their senses, which is the primary determinant for what they understand, you've disappeared. You've completely just disappeared, and that would lead to potentially some anxiety and confusion. But once you drop the blanket and you show your face again, they understand you're there. So it's a unique phenomenon that's interesting. That's again specific to this phase. Stranger anxiety is also a unique phenomenon. This is where this child in this age range would be very temperamental to who they are around. They want to be around mommy and daddy and whatever smells and surroundings they're familiar with. The 2 to 6 age range is the pre-operational stage, represents things with more words and images. So things are becoming a little bit more developed, a little bit more matured. They'll be able to pretend, play, and interact in a little bit more imaginary interactions. They start to become more me-focused or egocentric, where they're able to be aware of themselves, not so aware of others, and not so aware of what their interactions have on others, but they're starting to connect consequences to their behavior. They start to develop language and the meaning of words and sounds and how we use that to communicate. Ages 7 to 11 is the concrete operational stage. This is when children will start to think with logic. So using common sense or using reason or being rational, using analytical methods to determine or deduce things based on information you have, grasping different analogies. This is when conservation starts to come into play. So the example in the book is they have a container of milk, and let's see what page it's on. Essentially, the container is the same. You have 2 half-gallon containers, and then you have 2 glasses. One glass is short and it's wider, and then the other is tall and it's skinnier. And you pour the milk into each glass, and the tall, skinny one goes higher because it's thinner, and the short, wider one looks lower. But you see that the original source is a half-gallon, so it's the same amount. But the child will typically look at that short, skinny glass and say, oh, this one is more because it's taller. So still not being able to deduce or reason in the most effective way, but starting to have more understanding of concrete things. 12 years to adulthood is Piaget's formal operation stage. This is the thinking about hypothetical scenarios, being able to idealize and process abstract thoughts. So being able to think about things that maybe aren't real or things you haven't experienced, taking perspective, abstract logic, potential for mature morals, and reasoning starts to develop, all very critical for us to interact as humans, to be able to take those things into consideration. In the realm of developmental disorders, there used to be a group of disorders in the DSM, which is your Diagnostic Statistical Manual for mental disorders. It's what most therapists or psychologists diagnose out of. There used to be a category called pervasive developmental disorders, and autism was one of them. There used to be an Asperger's, which was a form of kind of autism. But now they typically use the phrase autism spectrum disorders because autism can present in such a range of traits and characteristics. It's hard to say that there's just one autism. There's a lot of different autisms. And traits common to people that have autism is communicative struggles, verbal and nonverbal. Typically, they'll perseverate or fixate on certain topics or themes, and they'll have rigid thinking and like to stick to routine or to maintain sameness, or some motor deficits. A lot of times you'll see students flapping hands, or stemming is what it's called, stereotypies, or motor movements that are maybe atypical that are done to self-soothe. So some traits common in this group of people that are inconsistent with your Piaget theory is the impaired theory of mind. The book talks a little bit about it. I would encourage you to look up any videos. YouTube, I'm sure, has some great explanations. I've seen some very entertaining philosophical videos that discuss the theory of mind. But essentially, it's your ability to theorize or entertain and understand others' perspectives and to personify things and understand sarcasm and to deduce analogies, all sorts of things like that. So it's hard for an individual with autism to relate to other people sometimes emotionally or understand what you're going through or interpret your facial expressions or your body language. Sometimes there'll be what's called comorbid diagnoses. So that's when more than one diagnosis or disorder occurs at the same time. And people with autism oftentimes have physical ailments like gastrointestinal or what's the irritable bowel syndrome or sleep disorders and a lot of food allergies and sensitivities, a lot of sensory issues that can be difficult because sound and light are often perceived more intensely. So a person with autism might not want to be in a crowded space. And it's hard enough with the verbal and communication difficulties to communicate and socialize. But oftentimes the sensory aspect of all the noise and commotion is difficult to process all at once. I've worked in schools with students who have autism and are also intellectually disabled, so they're having a hard time cognitively processing information at the same level as other people, as a typical functioning peer. And then their adaptive behaviors are also lower, so being able to conceptualize, communicate, and take care of themselves in the same way can be difficult. Some interesting things about autism is its prevalence. So how often it's diagnosed can change based on gender. So typically the Center for Disease Control does a study every 2 years, and they previously have stated that for every 4 boys, there's 1 girl that has autism. Other research that I've read a lot of and been a part of is suggesting there's maybe a little bit of a gap here where the research that established autism and the diagnostic criteria for it was largely based on boys. And so it's neglecting maybe an entire group of the female population. And a lot of women that are finally diagnosed with autism, struggling through their school years, maybe struggling to make friends and communicate effectively and process information and senses. And then they have those other impairments we talked about, aren't being diagnosed until they're in their adulthood. And there's a movement to try to better understand how autism and gender works and how to better identify young women that have autism and support them. Moving on to some parenting styles. The book talks about these 4 types of parenting styles. Typically, you have your authoritative parents. This is viewed as the ideal parenting scenario where you would have supportive parents, but also they have high expectations and they're involved and they're facilitating and helping understand, and they relate well to their kids, but they're not trying to be their kid's best friend. They understand their role as a parent. They're disciplinarians, but they're not dictators. And authoritarian parents tend to have this role of having high demands, disciplining, having zero tolerance models for discipline. So do this or else, and you get one chance. And they tend to not be as supportive. Student or children that go through this type of parenting can oftentimes have relationship struggles or be resentful of their parents. They might have some anger issues. It might be difficult to resolve conflict. They might argue more often. Permissive parenting on the bottom left, nice little South Park character, is typically highly supportive, but not high in demands. And so this, I think, is a trap that some parents get stuck in, because as kids are small and younger, a lot of parents just want to hug and nurture and be as supportive as possible. But it is a parent's job to challenge and to discipline and to condition kids to be good citizens and to be intelligent and to be fair and social and communicate effectively. And so when it comes to holding those standards high for a student or for a child, that can be where these parents struggle. It might be very supportive and well-intended, but not knowing how to groom and effectively discipline or raise that aspect of the child. Last, the bottom right, the neglectful parent is the uninvolved. So this is a parent model that's typically um, apathetic, or they're not nurturing, but they're not necessarily negating the student. They're not overly disciplining, but they're not helping with homework. They're kind of distracted and kind of aloof or unaware of how to interact and raise a child. This can also happen in parents that have multiple children, and at the end of the line, they're kind of just burnt out, or they have lost sight of what their parenting model includes. Each of these can be found again on a spectrum of severity. So there's not just a neglectful parents group. There's a variety of what neglectful parents can look like. And every parent will experience some level of each of these models. So each of you that's hearing this, I want you to think, oh, geez, that's my parent, and go home and tell them and have them read this book. Every parent goes through phases, and it's probably hardest for the child to identify which of these models a parent implements, because you're the subject, you're the one that it's focused on. It's another aspect of adolescent development, speaking of, is that perceived audience. At your age, you feel like everyone's watching you. You feel like you're a performer on a stage. You feel like you have to impress and always be putting on a show. And this can lead to a lot of high stress and feeling pressure. And this can lead to conformity and feeling like you have to do what your friends want you to do, or I have to do things better than the next person. And this imaginary audience can lead to what's called an invincibility complex, which is another trait of adolescent development, where at this age you probably feel unstoppable, like nothing could hurt you. A lot of people in their adolescence will do daring things, skateboard off a building, or scale a wall without a rope, or try to do some stunt that they're not trained for. And it's because at this age you're just filled with hormones, and you're filled with peer pressure, and you're figuring out who you are, your identity, what your limits are. So it's a wild time. I hope you're all enjoying it. But some other aspects of this adolescence, which is a broad range of development starting at puberty typically, and that's the biggest physical milestone for adolescence, is hitting puberty, developing more sexually, having early or late maturity. It can vary, and depending on your body type and your body fat to muscle ratio, or your BMI, that's typically what triggers puberty for most people. The teenage brain is a work in progress. It's developing differently for everyone, and it's developing throughout your adolescence. Into adulthood, your brain is still developing. You're developing power of reason, so you're starting to be able to think for yourself. You're starting to be able to put 2 and 2 together and understand why it equals 4, but how to use that knowledge and how to teach it is maybe difficult. So you're understanding things for yourself, and you're starting to build your own capacity, typically. A part of that is also developing your moral judgments, or your agency, your free will. You should typically at this stage be branching a little bit away from parents and starting to gain some independence. You're starting to gain an idea of what you want, or what you would see in your future, and what is important to you. A lot of this is shaped up until now by your parents and by your close friends and by your family, but developing your own moral stance and your own thoughts on things is important at this age. So part of this stage, again, we talked about forming identity, finding a sense of self. This is important in each one of the developmental theories. There's typically a undeveloped version, or the term would be self-actualized, when you reach a point where you're feeling optimized, you're the best version of yourself, you fully understand yourself, the good, the bad, the strengths, the weaknesses, and that's the ideal version, is to be in the middle, to be balanced, really. Autonomous would be the word. Again, we talked about pulling away from parents, and a lot of people might see this as, again, going to their mom or dad or whoever's a caregiver in your house and saying, hey, this book says you need to parent me less, or let me be more independent. Not necessarily what this means. What it's implying is that you are starting to gain your own self-identity. You're starting to understand what you think is important to you, and who your friends are, and what you want to do when you grow up. This can be different for everyone, though. It's not a concrete thing. It's not that categorical, or that Yeah, it's different for everyone. Also, a huge influence at this stage is your peers. You'll gravitate towards them and what you think they want you to do more than maybe what your parents. We talked about egocentrism in development, how earlier stages you're focused just on yourself. You could care less what other people think. Social anxiety does not typically exist for anyone under the age of 12. But then all of a sudden your peers start to matter. What they think starts to matter. How you look to them starts to matter. And it's incredible what you guys are going through with things like social media and with giant, massive high schools filled with over 2,000 students. It's a lot to take in. And growing up, I can't imagine if I had had Facebook, Instagram, TikTok, Snapchat. What was the other one? Vine. I don't know, all these things. There's probably more I don't know about. But there are constant stages we talked about, that perceived audience where you think you need to be impressing or showing off or performing. And with the internet, with Wi-Fi, with data plans, and with cell phones, you guys have constant access, but also constant pressure. I always encourage students I work with to allow themselves breaks and to really practice regulating use of that kind of stuff, because it can be damaging, or at least stressful or anxiety provoking. Again, the part of your brain that organizes and regulates your emotions is still very much developing. So you guys are given all this responsibility and pressure and a lot of stress in school, and you maybe haven't developed the necessary brain power to adequately cope with it. That's why having good friends and having a strong support group is so important at this age. Last things here as we wrap up. Another model for development is the psychosocial developmental models by Erik Erikson's stages. On page 91 is actually a better table. This has the adolescence through adulthood, but I am going to run through real quick the full table. So at infancy to 0 to 1 years old, you have the trust versus mistrust phase. And Erikson essentially posed a dichotomy, so two ends of a spectrum, and said, typically, while you're going through development, you'll face one or the other. You'll learn to trust or you'll learn to mistrust. And in this phase, a lot of young children develop temperament. And temperament is how easy you are provoked emotionally, or how easily you're distressed, or how easily you cope with being stressed or changed. And in a young infant, this can already at 1 year old be detected. 1 to 3, this is toddlerhood, is autonomy versus shame and doubt. So autonomy is a term for that self-actualizing. You're aware of yourself and other things around you. And for toddlers, 1 to 3 years old, they're not necessarily aware of things how you and I would think of it, but they're starting to exercise their will to do things for themselves. It's kind of egocentrism we talked about. If not given confidence and some independence in this stage, if they're not allowed to explore and fail and not be afraid of failure, a lot of times doubt in their abilities or shame of failing will develop in them. And so a young child is not allowed to explore, or is constantly comforted before they're able to self-soothe, or anytime a young child's about to fall, the parent catches them. That child never learns to fall. It doesn't know what it feels like to fall on their ass, or to trip and fall and catch themselves, or to cry for 30 seconds and get over it. And that can lead to a different temperament potentially. Preschool is 3 to 6 years of age, and this is the initiative versus guilt stage. At preschool age, you'll typically see students learning to initiate tasks or carry out plans. And if they have a hard time doing this, there might be a layer of guilt about their efforts, and not feeling independent. So being able to develop that skill of taking initiative, starting a task, following through, even at such a young age as 3 to 6, can be important. Elementary age, 6 years to puberty, this is the competence versus inferiority stage. Children in this stage learn the pleasure of applying themselves to tasks, or they might feel inferior. So if not given the opportunity to apply themselves and try new things and gain knowledge and understanding and interaction with other people or other things, there can be a development of inferiority, feeling like you don't deserve that opportunity, or feeling like an imposter, like you don't belong, or that's not for me, or I don't deserve that. A lot of those kind of feelings. Next, you have, and now we're onto this table on the PowerPoint slide, is the adolescence stage, teens into the early 20s. And this is the identity versus role confusion. So teenagers work to refine a sense of themselves by testing roles, integrating them to form a single identity. So this is when you might start challenging authority because you're trying to see what strength you have. How much can I push the limits? What boundaries can I test and create for myself? And what consequences are too much for me? How much responsibility can I take on? Can I handle a job while I play football? Can I manage dating this person as I'm trying to maintain my scholarship? Different kind of roles we try out and we see if we can embody. And if we develop that identity successfully, you can have that autonomy and that confidence. But if you're unsuccessful, or if you are inferior, or if you fail and you don't know how to cope, it can lead to some confusion of where you belong, or feeling like you don't maybe fit into the roles that you're put into. I also sympathize again for your guys' generation. There's a lot of pressure to meet a lot of expectations. And so a lot of the times young people as early as 14 or 15 are given just an incredible amount of responsibility, and they're not allowed to fail. And that can lead to some of this role confusion. Young adults, which is the early 20s through the 40s. And again, this is all fairly fluid, so it's not an exact science. Someone might be still in their identity versus role confusion phase or stage into their early to late 20s, or they might be starting their intimacy versus isolation stage in their early 20s or even late teens. So this stage is when young adults struggle to form close relationships and gain the capacity for intimate love. Or if this is not a successful stage, they might feel socially isolated. Now, not everybody needs to experience this in the same way. Some people don't need a relationship, but it's the capacity and really the understanding of how to relate and how to engage in intimacy or in deeper interactions or relationships. Middle adulthood, 40s to 60s, you have generativity versus stagnation. And this is a phase where a lot of middle-aged people, potentially having a midlife crisis or fearing the unknown or realizing that they're aging or feeling like they're running out of time, will discover a sense of contributing to the world, like they gave something back. They were good citizens. They were part of something. They had a purpose, usually through family or work, especially in America. Or they might feel a lack of purpose. And this can lead to feeling stuck or feeling apart from or neglected or depressed. It can lead to a lot of feelings of inferiority again, I think. That next stage, late adulthood, is 60 and up. Can't see it. There we go. So reflecting on their life, an older adult may feel a sense of satisfaction or failure. And this kind of puts it in the two terms, again, making it dichotomous, where I think this is probably more of a spectrum where you're somewhere between these two. You might feel a little bit of both. You might go back and forth. Again, this is psychology here. We're not talking about an exact science. So at the end of one's life, which doesn't always have to fall in this late 60s and beyond, but towards that end of someone's life, they typically reflect back. Did I contribute to society? Did I do my job well? Did I raise my kids how I wanted? And that despair is a really dangerous stage, because if you grow old and you don't feel like you've done any of those things, and you feel like you've run out of time, there's nothing you can do, then life might feel like you were robbed of some meaning, or you might feel like it's less important, or you're less important. So all the more reason, as we're developing and going through our stages of young adulthood and middle adulthood to late adulthood, that we're giving energy to that purpose, going through and making sure we're contributing and we're being a part of something. That is the last slide. This is the end of this lecture. I hope it was informative.